Yes, in 1876, the election of a U.S. president sure felt like it came from a secret backroom deal. It was a really messy time for the country. The Civil War was over, but the wounds were still fresh. The Reconstruction, which was the effort to rebuild the South and integrate formerly enslaved people, was still going on, but people were tired of it. There was a lot of tension, a lot of anger, and a lot of uncertainty. This election was right in the middle of all that. It pushed the country to the edge, making people wonder if we'd even avoid another civil conflict. It all started on Election Day, November 7th, 1876. The two main guys running were Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, and Samuel Tilden, the Democrat. Hayes was a governor from Ohio. He was seen as a pretty honest guy, a reformer who wanted to clean up government after all the scandals under President Grant. Tilden was a governor from New York. He was also a reformer, known for fighting political corruption in his state. Both candidates seemed like good choices for different reasons. When the votes started coming in on election night, it looked like Tilden had won. He was ahead in the popular vote by a lot, over 250,000 votes, and he seemed to have enough electoral votes too. Everyone thought it was over. Newspapers even printed headlines saying Tilden was the next president. The Democrats were celebrating, but then things got weird. Very quickly, Republicans started to challenge the results in a few states. They said there were problems with how the votes were counted. These states were Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. They were all southern states still under federal occupation because of Reconstruction. Their governments were run by Republicans, even though most white people in those states were Democrats. Plus, there was one electoral vote from Oregon that got into a fight too. The problem was, without those states, Tilden didn't have enough electoral votes to win. He had 184, one short of the 185 needed. Hayes only had 165. The three southern states had 19 electoral votes combined. If Hayes won all of them, he would have 185 electoral votes and become president. But if Tilden won even one of them, he would win. It was a complete deadlock. No one knew who the president would be. The country was in a huge constitutional crisis. It was a very scary time as people worried what would happen next. There was talk of protests, even of armed conflict. The situation was truly unprecedented and put the very stability of the nation at risk. The mess was deep. It involved serious questions about who voted, how votes were counted, and who had the right to decide. The problem was that these states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, were still under federal control after the Civil War. Republican governments, often propped up by federal troops and black voters, were in power there. But most white people in these states were Democrats. They hated Reconstruction and wanted the federal troops gone. This created a highly charged atmosphere. In these states, special groups called returning boards were in charge of counting the votes and certifying the results. These boards were controlled by Republicans, and they had a lot of power. They could decide which votes to count and which to throw out. That's exactly what they did. Democrats claimed that in these southern states, black voters, who usually voted Republican, were intimidated and prevented from voting by white Democrats. This was often done through threats and violence. On the other hand, Republicans on the returning boards claimed that Democrats had committed massive fraud. They said many Tilden votes were fake or came from people who weren't allowed to vote. So, the Republican-controlled boards started throwing out large numbers of Tilden's votes. They disqualified whole precincts. They certified that Hayes had won these states, giving all their electoral votes to him. For example, in Louisiana, the returning board threw out more than 13,000 Democratic votes. This swung the state from Tilden to Hayes. In Florida, they threw out around 3,000 Democratic votes, giving the state to Hayes by a tiny margin. South Carolina saw similar things happen. The Democrats, of course, cried foul. They said these boards were corrupt and acting purely out of partisan interest. They argued that the boards were stealing the election for Hayes. The situation was like a giant game of he said, she said, but with the presidency on the line. Each side had its own set of facts and its own accusations of fraud. It was impossible for anyone to truly know the real outcome, given how much tampering was happening on both sides. And then there was Oregon. That state wasn't in the South, but it also had a problem. Oregon had 3 electoral votes. The state had clearly voted for Hayes, but one of Hayes' electors was also a federal postmaster, which meant he held a federal office. The Constitution says electors can't hold a federal office, so the Democratic governor of Oregon replaced him with a Democratic elector. But the Republican electors met anyway and sent their own certificates to Washington, D.C., with all 3 votes for Hayes. The Democrats sent their own certificate, giving 2 votes to Hayes and 1 to Tilden. It was a small detail, but it just added to the whole complicated mess. So the election results from Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and one vote from Oregon were all sent to Congress, but each state sent two sets of results, one for Hayes and one for Tilden. With no clear winner, and two different results for so many states, Congress had a huge problem on its hands. There was no procedure in the Constitution for what to do when multiple sets of electoral votes arrived. This meant the country faced a truly unprecedented constitutional crisis. People worried about unrest, even a new civil war. With the country stuck in this deep crisis, Congress knew it had to do something. The Constitution didn't clearly say how to handle a disputed election like this. There were two different versions of the votes from several states. The House of Representatives was controlled by Democrats. The Senate was controlled by Republicans. If they couldn't agree, there would be no president. People were really scared. The memories of the Civil War were still fresh. Many worried that this election dispute could lead to more violence or even break up the country again. So in January 1877, just weeks before the new president was supposed to take office, Congress decided to create a special group to figure it out. This group was called the Electoral Commission. The idea was to make this commission fair. It would have 15 members. They picked 5 members from the House of Representatives, 5 from the Senate, and 5 from the Supreme Court. The members from the House would be 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans. The members from the Senate would be 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats. This was meant to balance things out. The most important part was the 5 Supreme Court justices. The plan was to pick 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats from the court. Then, the 5th justice was supposed to be independent, someone who didn't lean strongly to either party. The whole country looked to this swing, justice to be fair and break any ties. The justice everyone expected to be the independent one was David Davis. He was known for not being a strong party man. Both sides thought he might be fair. But then, right before the commission was formed, something unexpected happened. The Illinois state legislature elected David Davis to the U.S. Senate. This meant he couldn't serve on the commission anymore. He had to step down from the Supreme Court to take his Senate seat. This was a huge blow to the idea of a truly independent commission. Without Davis, they needed a new 5th Supreme Court justice. The next person in line, based on the setup, was Justice Joseph Bradley. And Bradley was a Republican, so instead of a balanced commission, it ended up with 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. This shifted the power significantly. The commission started its work in February 1877. It met to review the disputed returns from Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Oregon. For each state, the commission had to decide which set of electoral votes to accept. The rules they made for themselves were simple. They would decide which electoral certificate was regularly given by the state, and then they would announce their decision. Everyone watched closely as the commission started voting, and every single time, on every single disputed state, the vote was exactly the same, 8-7. 8 Republicans voted to give the electoral votes to Hayes. 7 Democrats voted to give them to Tilden. It was a straight party line vote every time. They declared Hayes the winner of all the disputed states. This meant Hayes would get all the electoral votes from Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and the disputed vote from Oregon. This would give him a total of 185 electoral votes, exactly one more than Tilden's 184. Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, was now set to become president, even though Tilden had won the popular vote by 250,000 votes. The Democrats in Congress were furious. They felt cheated. They believed the election had been stolen from them by a partisan commission. They threatened to filibuster the counting of the electoral votes. This meant they would talk and talk, preventing Congress from officially declaring Hayes president. If they did this, the country would reach March 4th, the inauguration day, with no president. That would be an even bigger crisis. This is where the real bargaining began. This is where the secret deal comes in. The Democrats were threatening to stop the process. They had the power to do it in the House. They wouldn't let Hayes become president easily, but the Republicans really wanted Hayes in the White House. So, informal talks started happening. These weren't public meetings with official records. These were discussions between prominent Democrats and Republicans, often behind closed doors, in places like private homes and the Wormley Hotel in Washington, D.C. That hotel became famous for these talks, giving the resulting agreement its common name, the Wormley Hotel Bargain. The Democrats had some big demands. They basically said, okay, we'll let Hayes win, but you have to give us something in return. Their main demand was the end of Reconstruction. This meant removing all federal troops from the southern states. For years, federal soldiers had been in places like South Carolina and Louisiana, protecting the Republican-led governments and the rights of black citizens. White Southerners, who were mostly Democrats, hated this. They saw it as an occupation. They wanted to take back full control of their states. Removing the troops would let them do that. Beyond ending Reconstruction, the Democrats also wanted federal money for the South. They wanted the government to invest in things like building railroads and improving infrastructure in their region. The South had been devastated by the Civil War, and they felt ignored by the federal government. A big one was funding for the Texas and Pacific Railway, which was supposed to connect the South to the West Coast. Another demand was that a Southerner, preferably a Democrat, be appointed to Hayes's cabinet. This would give the South some representation and a voice in the new administration. It was a way to show that Hayes, a Republican from the North, was willing to work with the South. The Republicans, led by people close to Hayes, started to signal that they were open to these ideas. They really needed the Democrats to back down and accept the commission's decision. They needed to avoid a complete breakdown of government. So the deal started to form. It wasn't one single signed document. It was more a series of understandings and promises made through these informal talks. The key part was that Democrats would allow the electoral count to finish. They wouldn't filibuster. In return, Hayes, once he became president, would agree to remove the remaining federal troops from the South. He would also promise to work towards funding for Southern development and consider a Southerner for his cabinet. This bargain was a compromise. It saved the country from a huge political crisis and ensured a peaceful transfer of power. But it came at a significant cost, especially for Black Americans in the South. The promise to end Reconstruction was a major concession. It would change the face of the South for decades to come. On March 2nd, 1877, just 2 days before Inauguration Day, Congress officially counted the electoral votes. The Democrats, after their deal, did not object. Rutherford B. Hayes was declared the winner with 185 electoral votes to Tilden's 184. It was the closest presidential election in U.S. history, decided by a single electoral vote, and only after intense, behind-the-scenes negotiations. The stage was set for Hayes to take office, but the consequences of this deal would be felt for generations. Rutherford B. Hayes became president on March 4th, 1877, just hours before he was supposed to take the oath. It was a very tense time. The country had gone right down to the wire, not knowing who would be president. But the deal worked. Democrats in Congress didn't filibuster the final vote count. Hayes was officially declared the winner, and Hayes kept his promises. Very quickly after taking office, he ordered the removal of federal troops from Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. These were the last states where troops were still stationed, protecting the Reconstruction governments. When the troops left, those Republican governments, which relied on federal support, collapsed. White Democrats quickly took back control of the state governments. This effectively ended Reconstruction. It was a very clear and immediate consequence of the deal. The removal of troops had a massive impact on Black Americans in the South. During Reconstruction, federal troops and laws had tried to protect their voting rights and civil liberties. With the troops gone, white Southern Democrats, often called Redeemers, quickly moved to strip away these rights. This led to the rise of Jim Crow laws, which enforced racial segregation and discrimination, and widespread disenfranchisement, where Black people were prevented from voting through poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright intimidation and violence. The promise of equality after the Civil War was largely abandoned. Beyond the troops, Hayes also showed good faith on the other parts of the deal. He appointed a Southerner, David M. Key of Tennessee, to his cabinet as Postmaster General. This was a symbolic gesture showing a willingness to include the South. And while the huge federal funding for Southern railroads didn't fully materialize as some Democrats hoped, the Hayes administration did support some efforts to improve Southern infrastructure. So, was it a deal? Yes, absolutely. It was a political compromise. The Democrats agreed to let Hayes become president. The Republicans, through Hayes, agreed to certain policies that the Democrats wanted. Was it secret? Not entirely, but the specifics were certainly negotiated in backrooms and informal meetings. The public didn't know all the details at the time. It was the kind of negotiation that happens outside of official channels, away from the public eye. Over time, the details of these discussions and the understanding that was reached became more widely known. The legacy of the 1876 election and the compromise that followed is complex and often seen as a stain on American democracy. It saved the country from a potential armed conflict and ensured a peaceful transfer of power, which is important. But it did so at a great moral cost. It effectively sacrificed the rights and protections of Black Americans in the South for political stability. It cemented the idea that national unity was more important than racial equality, at least for that time. This election also highlighted a big flaw in the U.S. Constitution. It didn't have clear rules for what to do when electoral votes were disputed so widely. The creation of the Electoral Commission was a one-time solution that revealed the partisan nature of such decisions. The whole episode left many feeling that the democratic process had been manipulated. It showed that even in a democracy, the political will to compromise can sometimes override the apparent will of the voters, with profound and long-lasting social consequences. It was a moment where the future of the nation was traded in a high-stakes political bargain.